Welcome to the BMJ podcast. I'm Duncan Jarvis, multimedia editor here. The BMJ has been campaigning for an end to too much medicine, the pernicious effect of marketing on a range of tests and treatments that doctors offer patients. Tests and treatments which are motivated by financial reward to the system rather than the health of the individual. A new analysis on bmj.com takes a look at what's happening in the first part of that, testing. New biomarkers for disease and new ways of monitoring have the potential to diagnose diseases more quickly. But is the hype backed by science? Bjørn Hoffmann, Professor of Medical Ethics at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and one of the authors of that analysis, doesn't think so and joins us on the podcast now to discuss. Bjørn, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in the article, you have a little example of a potential black box warning, and you say, maybe a little bit facetiously in there, the enclosed test result may induce worry or alternatively a false sense of security. It is also possible that results themselves are wrong and that the question of what you do with this information is unknown. But then you also go on to say in that the resulting wild goose chase may lead to personal bankruptcy in some countries. That's quite a statement. Is that something you worry about?
Yes, it really does, because new diagnostic tests should increase knowledge about diseases and increase people's health. And of course, if it does the opposite, there are reasons to worry. And we look into some examples where the potential for benefit is quite substantial, but also where the potential for the harms are significant.
And you've got a couple of good examples in the paper, which I think people should go and read. But if we take for a start, you talk about immunosignatures for cancer and infections. So essentially, this is testing for a range of peptides in the blood that have been linked to cancer infection. But you say that the study there was reported in Nature Communications, and the results were from 50 patients of each type. Now that seems like interesting research and good research to do, but it also seems like pretty early research, and yet that's already being marketed. Is that atypical for some of the things that you're worrying about?
Yes, definitely. I am, quite optimistic with regards to new tests entering the market and their potential use in the clinic in the future. We see that a lot of these tests, for instance, immunosignature, they're tested with quite few patients. And of course, as these are new diagnostics, they will be published, but their results are also used very optimistically, for instance, to gain and increase the venture capital, and also to enter these tests into the markets. And we've monitored some of the results, and the results look quite positive, and very optimistically, they report high numbers of sensitivity and specificity. But when we look closer at that, we see that, there are not that many patients, and the patients or persons that are tested may be not very representative for the general population where the tests may be used. So we're quite worried about the external validity of these tests.
And now another one that you look at is the breath test for lung cancer. So it's looking for a biochemical signature for the disease. Now, it's claimed there that this could save 10,000 lives and £24 million in the NHS alone. But then when you go into that a bit further, you say that the false positive rate is somewhere between 0 and 83%. It's pretty wide. And that the sensitivity is somewhere between 51 and 100%, so not very sensitive. So you could end up there with a lot of people being told that they have cancer when they don't, or potentially people being reassured that they have they don't have cancer when they shouldn't be reassured. And I think this struck me that this wouldn't pass what we would expect of a screening test in the UK anyway, and yet it's still being hyped and still being marketed.
Yes, and that worries us also because, I mean, it would, of course, be fantastic if you had some kind of a cancer sniffing test, which you even could couple to your mobile phone or iPhone. But at the same time, if this becomes widespread, you would have a lot of false alarms and a lot of people seeking healthcare. And also, this could increase health anxiety, and that's one of the worries we have, which we highlight in our publication.
And then the third one, there are more in the paper, and I again would suggest people read that to find out more. But the third test that you talk about is a test for Alzheimer's disease. Now, at the moment, that's a clinical diagnosis. It's also, there is some controversy around a diagnosis for it, and yet people are developing blood tests that could potentially, or they say could show the likelihood of this occurring maybe 10 years in advance. So what's your worry about that?
This is very interesting, and also I think it's it's about disease which a lot of people fear, which is quite prevalent in the populations, and which gains a lot of attention. And some of the results also indicate that, well, you can have high sensitivities for detecting Alzheimer's disease, about 95%, and even with regards to predicting Alzheimer's disease over a time period of 2 to 3 years, reports of 90% sensitivity are available. However, if you look closer, it's very hard to replicate these results. So what we're concerned about is the harms and the costs also if you launch these into the market before they're well and appropriately tested. For instance, false positive rates may be quite high in ordinary populations. And also because some of the test results are done with people with definite disease, and when you test for specificity, they may be in quite healthy populations. So they're not representative for the population which will be relevant for the clinical use of these. And of course, even if the tests are accurate, the question comes, well, how actionable are these are the results of these tests? What can you do? And as long as you can't do anything about them, you should worry about other things, like, for instance, what will result from this with regards to emotional despair, stigma, discrimination, and also in areas where you do not, as you mentioned, you have a clinical diagnosis for this, and if you then have a biomarker and a quantitative and so-called objective standard for testing, this may become the gold standard for diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, i.e. it will define the disease. And of course, if you do that without a very, very good and validated diagnostic test, you may end up places where you really didn't want to go.
And I mentioned at the beginning our Too Much Medicine campaign, and a big part of that has been looking at the problem of overdiagnosis, and especially where diagnoses, maybe definitions expand over time. And I suppose if you're trying to put a quantitative measure on something like Alzheimer's, it then will inevitably lead to that kind of creep as well.
Yes, and if biomarkers generally produce long lead times, such as, for instance, 10 years before clinical onset, they will simultaneously create potential for overdiagnosis, as many will die from other diseases before they develop Alzheimer's disease. So the potential for overdiagnosis in this field is tremendous.
Now, despite all those sort of unproven clinical benefits that you've talked about, you say that the market's expectation of these tests is very high, and that investment revenues have grown from 22.4 to 53.6 billion, so it's more than doubled since 2012. And that might be due to the misleading sort of positive feedback effect from some of the marketing that you've mentioned.
Yes, we were struck by the vast amount of venture capital going into these new medical diagnostics. The global biomarker market is expected to double between 2012 and 2018, and the mobile health market is growing yet even faster. A tenfold increase is expected over the same time period. We have identified two types of feedback loops, positive feedback loops, one on the populational level and one on the individual level. On the populational level, tests tend to increase the apparent prevalence of diseases and abnormalities. This fosters more concerns and thus more testing. At the same time, improved testing tends to identify patients with milder disease and abnormalities, and these patients invariably do better than those diagnosed as having the disease in the past, apparently reinforcing the value of testing. And on the individual level, people will either feel reassured from a negative test, or they will be relieved when a positive test are disapproved, or they will falsely believe that they have been saved from disease when actually they have been overdiagnosed. And all these events will spur more testing.
Now, quite often with new technologies and things, we expect the market to be self-regulating, for it to pick out the things that actually work and invest in them and let the other products sort of fade away. But if the market has become distorted by the feedback loops that you've talked about, what do you think should be done to try and regulate it a little bit more, try and make sure that only good tests that actually help patients are developed?
Health policymakers and payers should be aware of downstream costs from new diagnostics, and also they should be worried about and concerned about and focus on widened definitions of disease. Regulators on their side should care about all the new diagnostics entering the market without proper assessment of their clinical value. So assessment here is very important. And this is where I think researchers could contribute significantly by proper validation of new diagnostics. They should be able to assess whether the diagnostic tests are accurate, but not only accurate. Even for accurate tests, you have to assess whether they're actually actionable. And even for actionable tests, they should assess whether the actions are important for people. And what happens to those who the tests do not benefit. So I think on all these levels, important measures can be and should be taken.
In the UK and elsewhere around the world, we've seen a sort of growth of direct-to-consumer advertising for these things. So it seems like educating patients about these tests is actually really important.
Yes, and this will, I think, become more important with all these new tests and biomarkers entering the market and being promoted as being beneficial to people's health. And I think we all have a responsibility to try to educate patients and physicians in particular by informing them not only about the potential benefits but also about the dilemmas and harms of the testing and what challenges they will have if they have a test and they may have inconclusive results, they will enter new diagnostic odysseys where they will face with a lot of difficult decisions, and which they and also information which they were not maybe not aware of in the first place. So this task of educating us as a population and patients in particular is not only a task of regulators and health policymakers, but also of physicians. And I think it's very important to do so, as the pressure from these tests may become very, very significant in the future.
And clinicians need to be aware that these tests will end up in their office, even if they aren't necessarily clinical tests that they would order themselves, that patients will be potentially accessing these and bringing the results to them.
Yes, as these direct-to-consumer tests or other marketed tests will become more available, people will take them, but they will not know how to interpret the results, and they will enter the physician's office with a lot of questions with regards to how to handle this. So the tests who are not approved of will enter the clinician's office, and the clinician will have to face with them. The challenge here is, of course, that they may generate a lot of health anxiety and worries and subsequent testing, and for the clinician, they may be noise and will distract from other and more important work with regards to their patients. And of course, patients will may become more anxious about their health as a result of this.
You've been listening to Bjorn Hoffman discuss his article, New Diagnostic Test.